And I often say to young students on campus these days, what you endure takes a certain kind of spiritual courage. And so in some ways, the great blessing of America, the embrace of America, has turned into a bit of a strangulation, strangling our voice, strangling our leaders, strangling the critique of a DEI, white privilege language, which is robbing us as American Jews of our story. We have, I don't want to get too political, but we have a government which most people have lost confidence in. We have a series of impossible dilemmas we have to be navigating constantly. We have a world that has turned on us. We have corners of the Jewish world that have turned on us. And yet every single day, when I walk around the streets of Jerusalem, when I visit in the north and the south, I am inspired by the incredible resilience, the incredible patriotism, and the incredible fortitude.
Welcome to The Contrarian. I'm David Bernstein. In a world filled with noise, I'm here to provide the signal. Hi, and welcome to The Contrarian. I'm your host, David Bernstein. Today, we speak with Gil Troy, who I've known for a while and have always considered one of the finest academic and Jewish minds as well. So, Gil, it's really amazing to see you. You're in Israel now, but you also spend a lot of time in the U.S. and Canada.
Yes, we're based in Jerusalem. We have kids in the army. We're living the life, but indeed, I'm back and forth a lot. And I just want to say what an honor it is to be with you. I think you've been such an important voice for true liberalism. And more than that, integrity and truth. And these are, unfortunately, in very, very short supply in the places where we worshipped, the universities, the media, the centers of our democracy. So thank you.
Well, I thank you. You've been so prolific and so eloquent in this moment, and it's been good to have that voice. Let me ask you, you're in Israel and you're obviously have kids in the army, as you said. What are you feeling now? What's the country like? What's the mood of the country right now?
Look, it's hard to believe it's been 5 months. It's hard to believe that we have hostages who are still in the hands of these savages. There are an estimated 19 or 20 young women who are probably enduring unspeakable sexual crimes day to day, hour by hour. There are dozens of young men who are also being brutalized and tortured. And the world goes on. And that's a very, very difficult thing to sit with. We've also buried such unbelievable people. Day after day, we read the stories of these young heroes who are willing to sacrifice life and also limb for this ideal, for this idea. And the idea is that the Jews deserve a homeland and deserve to live as a free people in their homeland. And the ideal is that all of us deserve to live under liberal democracies with truth and integrity and freedom. And make no mistake about it, my friends, this is a civilizational battle. And Israel is very much on the front lines of a fight for Western civilization. And our young people are bearing the brunt, and our young people really feel it. They know this isn't just about Israel, isn't just about Jews. This is about democracy and West.
Do you think that the mood remains strong in Israel? Are people still in on the fight, or do you think that's waning in any way?
Look, we're in an absurd situation. We have, I don't want to get too political, but we have a government which most people have lost confidence in. We have a series of impossible dilemmas we have to be navigating constantly. We have a world that has turned on us. We have corners of the Jewish world that have turned on us. And yet every single day, when I walk around the streets of Jerusalem, when I visit in the north and the south, I am inspired by the incredible resilience, the incredible patriotism, and the incredible fortitude. And for all the trauma that every single one of us has endured, and when I say every single one of us, I mean, again, not just Israelis, not just Jews, but liberal Democrats all over the world. For every one of those traumas, we've also seen 5, 10, 15 examples of heroism, of inspiration. And I don't believe that Israel is willing to give up. I don't believe that Israel is willing to quit. And when everybody calls for a ceasefire, I say, absolutely. I need a ceasefire from Hezbollah. I need a ceasefire from the Houthis. I need a ceasefire and release of hostages from the Hamas. Then talk to me about a ceasefire.
Yeah. So this podcast and our conversation are going to sort of delve into what's wrong with the U.S. or Canadian university. I know you're a professor at McGill, but also you teach in Israeli universities. How would you characterize the situation at Israeli universities? And so many young Israeli students must be in the reserves or in the army right now. What's it like being on a campus?
I have a young friend. He's actually the fiance of my youngest daughter, Dina. His name is Yona Shemesh, and he told an amazing story. He's been serving up north. 2 weeks ago, he came straight from serving up north to the university because he's trying to save his semester. He walked into a Hebrew University lecture class in, as they say, madim, in uniform, with his kit bag and with his gun, and people stood up and applauded. And I was so moved because I fear that if he had walked into a Harvard classroom, a McGill classroom, a Yale classroom, even with a T-shirt that said, "I'm Jewish," let alone Israeli, let alone pro-Israel, let alone pro-Tzahal, IDF, he would not only have been booed, but he might fear for his life. And I often say to young students on campus these days, what you endure takes a certain kind of spiritual courage. Certainly my son-in-law to be Yona and my sons and my daughter, when they walk around in uniform, they get what we call firgun, which is a great Hebrew word, which basically is like attaboy, but now we have to say attapersonism, right? A slap on the shoulder. That's great. Where are you serving? Thank you for your service. Kol hakavod. Hats off. And if you're on an American campus and you simply assert your identity, simply live your truth, and maybe it's a little mezuzah around the neck, maybe it is a hostage tag showing empathy for these people who were snatched from their homes in the most brutal of ways and are being brutalized, as I said, you risk social ostracism. And unfortunately, on too many campuses today, you risk attack. So to be a young Jew on campus today, to be a young lowercase liberal Democrat, lowercase L, lowercase d, requires a certain spiritual courage that my kids with all their physical courage don't need. And that's heartbreaking.
Yeah. Have you noticed any of this sort of postmodernist radical trends taking hold in Israeli universities and among Israeli students?
Are we talking October 6th or October 8th? So October 6th.
Right, start with October 6th.
So, October 6th, there definitely was an issue. And in fact, when I told Yona's parents that he was applauded, they were shocked because a year ago, 6 months ago, he was telling stories of some classes at Hebrew University, which were remarkably hostile to some of the liberal democratic ideals that you've been upholding, some of the Zionist ideas that you and I share. And it was quite shocking. I have a friend who works with many Israeli Arabs, and he said that when he works with mayors and leaders from the Israeli Arab world who are dentists, who are physicians, who are pharmacists, who are accountants, who have gone through Hebrew University or Tel Aviv University or Ben Gurion University, but they took courses that were more pragmatic, they tend to be very pragmatic or more in the STEM world. He says, but when he works with people who are graduates of Hebrew University, Tel Aviv University, from the anthropology world, the sociology world, the history world, my world, they often are quite hostile to Israel because many of their professors are like that. That was the story as of October 6th. Since then, we have seen a remarkable unity, not uniformity, but unity on the part especially of our young people. And we also have to take hats off 70% of Israeli Arabs on October 7th. First of all, saw how many Israeli Arabs, Druze, Bedouin, Muslims were slaughtered by Hamas in an anti-Semitic zeal. And it was anti-Semitic. These young Arab people and Druze and Bedouin and Christians died out of anti-Semitism. Why? Because the hatred against the Jew, Itbachal Yehud, destroy the Jew, was so great that if you were Jew adjacent, if you were Israel adjacent, if you were on the wrong side of the border, you too were slaughtered. Nepalese workers, Thai workers. And so things are shifting. And post-October 8th, there's much more of a realization that the postmodernism, the wokeness, the political correctness of yesteryear not only didn't serve us, but when we naturally see what's happening on American campuses, is actually against us. And a threat.
So you split your time between Israeli universities and Canadian universities, McGill. Have you been to McGill since October 7th? Have you taught there?
I haven't taught there, but I'll tell you one devastating anecdote, which is that, and McGill for many years, I've taught American history. That's my thing. right? But as a citizen of the world and as a Jew, I've also articulated what I call identity Zionism, a positive vision of Zionism. And I was always very careful when I taught American history, because I knew that I had students who were from the left, from the right, Arabs, Muslims, pro-Israel, anti-Israel. I was teaching about American history. And frankly, Israel doesn't loom large. I know Jews think it does, but Israel doesn't loom that large in American history. There was a flyer circulated at McGill University 3 weeks ago. Boycott Zionist courses. And of course, they spell Zionist, which in Canada is a Z, lowercase z, right? Because they want to show disrespect for Zionism in the most sophomoric of ways. And what were they protesting? They were protesting outside the Bronfman building, and they actually blocked the Bronfman building. Why? Because even though it's the commerce school, the business school, the Bronfmans are evil because they're Zionist adjacent, because they also support Zionism. And on top of that, they were objecting to a Zionist course, not one of my courses, but I would have been targeted had I been teaching this semester. It was a course that had some connection to Heather Reisman. Heather Reisman is a philanthropist who also supports lone soldiers in Israel. So you see what's going on? The desire to make Israel, Zionism, and yes, Jews, radioactive, is now so strong that if you also support Israel, you are deemed to be evil because you are somehow part of this broader network. And that's what's going on at McGill. At Concordia University, which is a kilometer from McGill, they set a table, an empty Sabbath table for hostages, and it was knocked over. There's a violence, there's a viciousness that we're seeing both in Canada and the United States, let alone in Europe. It's a kind of Europeanization of the American and Canadian campus. And what most upsets me is if I see a demonstration and I see an American flag, I know I'm often going to see an Israeli flag. The demonstrations against Israel in the United States and in Canada are against the United States and Canada as well. And that's why they attack, when they're off campus, they attack the Rockefeller Center tree lighting ceremony. They attack traffic going to LAX or JFK airports on Christmas time. They attack and graffiti the White House and the Lincoln Memorial. So my friends, we have to be very, very clear. This is not just about Jews and Israel. This is an attack on America, Canada, and liberal democracy, and on these broader icons of our democracy and of our freedom.
So you said that, Canada and the United States have been Europeanized, and I've had the exact same sense that we've seen the sort of post-colonial ideology for many years sort of be a dominant stream on the left in European societies, less so in the United States. I've always gotten the impression, though, that Canada sort of Europeanized before the U.S. did in many ways. And I've also have the sense, and it might have to do with demographics, that maybe the Canadian university on average is worse off than the American university. What is your sense of that?
So Canadians are more polite, and that's a factor. But certainly, and it's very important when we speak about universities that we distinguish, because there are certain universities which are real hotbeds of this kind of ideology.
Concordia.
Which are not, right? So Concordia was always an extreme. McGill was actually very quiet 20 and 30 years ago, and it's become more inflamed. York University has been a hotbed. And you're right, it's three fundamental things going on. One, the baseline in Canada. And we forget this, and the Biden administration, I'm sorry to say, forgets this. The baseline in the United States of America is going back 20 years. The Gallup polls show that 70 to 85% of Americans support Israel. And certainly in a poll, when you ask Americans today, do you support Israel over Hamas? 70 to 80% say Israel. The baseline in Canada is 40 to 50%. So they start among mainstream Canadians much lower. You add to it an orientation toward Europe and toward postmodernism and toward colonialism that was ahead of America. And then you add the demographics, which is that you have a larger and more extreme Muslim population, and you have many more foreign students. And there was an important article in Tablet magazine last week talking about this, how now that's happening in the United States of America. Follow the money. Follow just how many students are being brought from abroad, A, because they pay the full fare, but here in a real perversion, B, because many of them allow the universities to check off their affirmative action boxes.
Yes.
Now, how have we allowed, and frankly, how have my Black American brothers and sisters allowed? How have my Hispanic brothers and sisters allowed this kind of distortion, this kind of perversion, where you take affirmative action, which we can debate this for hours, but affirmative action was an attempt to ameliorate past discrimination that American groups, American minorities endured, and you bypass and you say, oh, look how great, look at our great percentages by bringing in foreigners who don't respect American ideals. And frankly, they're the wealthiest of wealthy who are coming and often oppressing people in their own country. And mommy and daddy are sending them their Black American Express card and paying full fare so that they can go ahead and then bring a kind of goonish politics to American campus. This is insane and self-destructive on every single level. It's self-destructive among liberals, it's self-destructive among academics, and it's self-destructive among the minorities who've been pushing for an affirmative action regime, which is supposed to help them and doesn't help them at all.
Yeah, we've spent a lot of time talking about the role of Qatari money and Saudi money and others, Chinese money on American universities. I don't think we've spent nearly enough time talking about the role of foreign student money in these universities. I thought that tablet piece was extremely important and really pointed to a reality that we have to think about and do something about.
I always say, yes, follow the money, but also follow the professors. Because at the end of the day, students come through. They're passing. Everybody focuses on the college presidents who said this stupid thing or that stupid thing. They're kind of distant. To me, the most dangerous thing going on campus today is what's going on in the learned societies. Follow the professorship and see the conversation that's going on in the American Sociological Association, the MLA, the Modern Language Association, the AHA, the American Historical Association, in their bylaws, which 100 years ago were established as lowercase p progressive organizations devoted to the study of and the advancements of knowledge. Now, in their DNA, in their defining statements are statements about fighting inequity, creating equality, but they mean equity and advancing the DEI regime. And so what does that mean? It means I would not get a job because I wouldn't get endorsed by fellow professors. And I won't get book prizes and I won't get promoted. And that's going to take decades to undo. Yeah. Student trends can change. University presidents we've seen can be toppled. But when you have now decades worth of academics who hire themselves, who perpetuate themselves, who are only judging you not on the quality of your scholarship, certainly not on the independence of your mind, but on how slavishly you follow their political agenda, then we're really in trouble.
Yeah. Look, it took multiple generations to get here. It's going to take a generation, if not more, to get back to some semblance of sanity. And that's part of what we're trying to explore here. Before we go deeper into the university scene, though, I wanted to sort of stay with Canada and the United States for a second. I've been observing, obviously, the ideological trends in the United States, not just on campus, but more generally, and also Canada at the same time. I speak to a lot of Canadians. I've been to Toronto a couple of times. We're actually thinking of bringing my organization, the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, into Toronto as one of our sort of pilot projects. And we're speaking to some key people in the Toronto Jewish community. And I've been struck that the ideology, whatever we choose to call it, I know woke is no longer an acceptable term in some circles, so we'll call it radical social justice ideology or something else. I've noticed that it actually it seems to spread much quicker in Canada than the United States. My theory has always been that there's no counterbalance to it, no political counterbalance to it in Canada as there is in the United States. You have sort of a political wall in Canada, in the United States, that you don't have in Canada. What's your take?
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness on one hand, peace, order, and good government on the other hand. So if I'm a mainstream Canadian, I really believe in the civility. And by the way, you see it, right? That it is expressed in kind of civility. But also, what is peace, order, and good government? It's a recipe for cocooning. And it's a recipe for a certain kind of civility, but also a certain kind of passivity. The passion that at least a critical number of Americans have for advancing life, advancing liberty, and that wonderful phrase, which starts with John Locke, but that Thomas Jefferson picked up on, pursuing happiness is much more active, much more dynamic. And as a result, there is much more pushback. Now, I just want to add one other dimension to the Canadian thing, which is truly depressing. I flew into Florida about 3 weeks ago to speak actually to a group of Toronto snowbirds who were spending their winter in Miami. And they said, look, we come every year and we love coming because of the temperature gap. And, Toronto in early February versus Miami in early February. But they said for the first time in our lives, we feel much safer here. And there were two interesting things about that. One is they were really talking about, in Toronto, I'm hearing it in Montreal, not feeling that the police, not feeling that the mayor, not feeling that the prime minister has their back on a goonish kind of anti-Semitism. I'm not talking about some kind of politically correct article that's written. I'm talking about a real physicality that is trying to block the Bronfman building, as I mentioned, at McGill, that just 3 days ago laid siege to the Federation building in Montreal, that led in Toronto to the trashing of Starbucks and the vandalism of Starbucks on Bathurst, which is one of the main streets in Toronto. And so there is a virulent anti-Semitism. My campus friends in the United States, I guess, again, certain campuses are feeling some of that, but very, very few of my friends walking around New York City, Boston, Washington are feeling really threatened. But in Toronto, these people felt the threat. And that was really shocking. Now, here's another thing. Let me get even more politically incorrect. I had a number of conversations in Florida, including one, my favorite, with somebody who said, I have 15 things I could argue with DeSantis about. He's wrong on abortion, and he's wrong here, and he's wrong there. But I have to say, this man was saying, since the George Floyd riots in 2020, DeSantis, the mayors, the police have said there is zero tolerance for any kind of hooliganism. If you break something, you will pay for it, both literally, and you will also end up in jail. And they said there's a sense of law and order here in the best sort of way. That means that we feel like the government now, during this moment of anti-Semitism, has our back. And so these Toronto Jews, and I'm talking about many of the wealthiest, most established, most generous Toronto Jews, real leaders of the community who have invested in Canada and believe in Canada and believe in the Canadian ideal, peace, order, and good government, are not getting a sense of peace, are seeing social disorder, are seeing bad government, and they're not being protected. And that's devastating.
Yeah. It seems to me that one fear is that the United States, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is becoming more like peace, order, and good governance. And we're becoming more like Canada in many ways. Another point of contrast, though, that I wanted to ask you about is that, and this is, Advantage Canada, at least as far as I'm concerned, I've always felt that the Canadian Jewish community was sort of a more typical diaspora community. It was less sort of joined at the hip with any ideological or political camp, as, unlike the American Jewish community, which has a deep psychological connection to the Democratic Party and to the left. Canadian Jews weren't like that. Canadian Jews seem more unapologetically Zionist. And so whatever disconnect there is between Canadian Jews and the larger Canadian public, Canadian Jews seem to sort of, be open to talking about these ideological trends. Like, I'll just give you an example. I've spoken several times in both Canada and the United States. Some of the earliest talks that I gave critiquing radical social justice ideology in the Jewish community were to Canadian audiences because they seemed less worried about me violating some, piety. Whereas in the United States, there was this, the fear of violating, in the Jewish community that I didn't feel, that I have never felt in Canada. What is your take on that?
There was a study 4 or 5 years ago looking at the Pew study from the United States of America, and in that study, they asked the similar kind of questions of the Canadian Jewish community. And what did they discover about the Canadian Jewish community? That it is more deeply Zionist, which I think is relevant here. Mm-hmm. It Absolutely. Is much more independent of political parties. Mm-hmm. The average Canadian had been to Israel 5 times. The average Canadian Jew had been to Israel 5 times, over 60%. There's a much higher percentage of young Canadian kids who go to Jewish day school. And I used to say when I lived in Canada, I don't need a crystal ball to know what's going to happen in Canada. We just need to look south because the trends in America and the American Jewish community are ahead. So what's going on? 3 things. One, just deeper, better educated, more Jewishly committed and rich environment. And by the way, it was because you could see also their Judaism was often a religious one and a national one and a social cultural one. In many of the Pew study results in America, the American Jewish community, they have one dimension. And so you could see the intertwined rope, which is very important for identity. That's one dimension. Second dimension, we have actually seen the Canadian Liberal Party, which was the Jewish party, the party that many of the Jews supported, has not been as pro-Israel as it should have been. We see a huge difference, let's say, between Stephen Harper, who the former conservative prime minister who just visited Israel, and my daughter, who was in the army, had a chance to brief him and meet him for a few minutes, versus Justin Trudeau. And what we're seeing is exactly what you say, which is Canadian Jews are leaving the Liberal Party. Their commitment ultimately to Israel and to their Jewish identity, and I would say to truth, justice, and the liberal democratic way, runs much deeper than an affiliation to a particular party. Whereas many of my American Jewish friends are in stress over what's happening in certain corners of the Democratic Party, but they're sticking with the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
The third dimension,
although that remains to be seen. There was some initial polling data that should give people some. Yeah.
There's some, but the leadership is not there. The leadership is still very tied in. And
I want to return to that, by the way, and toward the end of this podcast, because I think this is fascinating. I think there's a growing disconnect between the rank and file American Jew and the Jewish establishment. But we'll return to that.
All right. And then when we talk about Canada, we also have to just talk about the fact that Canadian Jews feel more other. They feel less at home. And do the math. Your typical American Jew, and I know you're not a typical American Jew. You've written so beautifully in your book. But the typical American Jew is what my kids would have been if I hadn't moved to Israel, which is already fourth generation. My grandparents came over on what we call the boat, as if there was the boat that brought 2 million Jews from 1880 to 1920. The surge in growth in the Canadian Jewish community was during World War II, after World War II, after the Holocaust. So they are fewer generations into the Canadian story. Many more of them are tied to the Shoah. Many more of them have grandparents with accents. Many more of them know where their passport is hidden and are ready to go in a moment's notice. And so in some ways, the great blessing of America, the embrace of America, has turned into a bit of a strangulation. Strangling our voice, strangling our leaders, strangling the critique of a DEI, white privilege language, which is robbing us as American Jews of our story, of our greatness, of the secrets to our success, which basically said you use smarts and you use sweats to get ahead. And the whitening of American Jews, which is so absurd, which is so disrespectful to your Iraqi roots and to and even let's not get to the fact that there are people of color who are Jews. That assumes that if they weren't, there'd be something wrong with them. Right? It's the injection of a racialism and a sexism that defines people only by the color of their skin, not the content of their character, and only by a certain form of gender that is insane. And too many American Jews, and again, too many Jewish leaders, and we've talked about this before, David, have bought into it. And it really was part of your journey and part of your greatness and your independence to break out of that groupthink. Because when I tried calling people out on that over the 1619 issue, and I called it the 1619ization of American Jewry, and I said I hadn't seen such a mass act of ideological suicide and self-harm in decades. Very few leaders of the American Jewish establishment, some of whom are personal friends, even responded to my email when I personally sent them the article because they just couldn't handle it. They didn't want to touch it.
They might have silently agreed with you, but just couldn't contend with the implications of that, which is another thing I want to return to in a moment. But I want to get to the structure of the university. I've been using the metaphor of the iceberg. You see that in a lot of PowerPoint presentations and businesses. There's the tip of the iceberg above the waterline, and then there's the deeper reality, the bummock of the iceberg below the waterline. And I've been arguing that what we see above the waterline, the anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, is what most people respond to, or the radical, marches on campuses and the like. But below the waterline is this sort of deep-seated ideological rot, the starting with, let's say, postmodernism, but more, contemporary forms of extreme ideology and the like that have caught on and off campus, but especially on campus. And that's producing the reality above the waterline. And first of all, I guess the question is, do you agree with that characterization, A? But B, if so, what do we do about that deep-seated reality?
Look, it's a big problem. First, let's put one nuance in, which is there's a huge difference between what I call the silence of the tenured lambs in humanities.
Yes.
In my world, right? Who are far more willing to, first of all, be bullied, but second of all, to buy into this DEI regime, to this nonsense that I can reduce everybody to the oppressors, the updating of Marx and Fanon and all these other thinkers, and I put thinkers in quotation marks because they celebrated violence It's in the DNA of their writing. And that has overtaken, as I was saying earlier, many of the learned societies in social sciences and in humanities. If you look back, going back to 20, 25 years ago, when we first met in the pro-Israel community, anytime there's been a massive pushback against BDS boycotts of Israeli institutions, against any backlashing against Israel, it comes from STEM. It comes from science. It comes from technology. It comes from the medical world. And there's a huge difference because those people, first of all, don't boycott knowledge because they know they can't take the microchip that might have been developed by my daughter's company in Tel Aviv and take it out if they want their experiment to succeed or if they want their computer or iPhone to work. So they're much more open and they're also much less politicized. So, and that's an important lesson because it shows how deep-seated the rot is in certain parts of the university, but it shows that there are other people who are saying, hey, wait a minute, I just can't play this game. Now we're starting to see, the attack on math is white and all that, but it's still very much on the margins. But it's a warning sign because that attack started on the margins in social sciences and in humanities and now has gone mainstream. So that's one piece. The second is, look, I share with you the frustration that this will take decades. So what can we do? I think we have to think in three different dimensions. One, I think within universities, I would call on people like Bill Ackman, who's just become a symbol. People with serious money. I'm not going to fix Harvard. I'm not going to fix Yale. I'm not going to fix Rutgers. But what I can do is, why can't I establish a center of liberal thought?
Yeah.
A center of critical thinking, a center of big ideas, of book learning, of great books. Call it the right word, right? And then I do two things. One is I show as a consumer to the next generation, here's an alternative. And I think over years, we'll start seeing more and more students taking courses and majors in this kind of honors type college, because I don't think most students want to be propagandized. Yeah. Secondly, we have enough of these centers pop up. Then what we can also do is we can bypass the problem of that I would not get tenure and I wouldn't get promoted from the American Historical Association. But if we have an association of liberal thinkers, of liberal scholars, and then I get invited to speak to their different universities, and we create book prizes, and we create promotions, and we create parallel tracks within the university culture, then we've done exactly what they did. We've gone inside, learned, and then changed things. So that's the first prong. The other two prongs are, one, I call this polarized. Our students, before we're starting to see even before they enter high school, but certainly before they enter college, have to read your book, have to have courses, have to work with their parents, have to go in knowing that all too often they're entering in, I call it the poisoned ivy world. And I know you've used that expression too, right? That there's a distortion there and they have to be ready for it. And the part three is, let's look at what's happening in Israeli universities and let's start building up the English language programs and their reputations at Tel Aviv, at Hebrew University, at what used to be called the IDC, Reichman Institution, the Technion in the STEM world, and the Weizmann Institute have a reputation that is worldwide. If we build up the English language institutions on the humanities and social science scales, then our kids have an alternative and our colleagues have an alternative to go teach there and build a world which isn't, I don't want it to be a Zionist propaganda center.
Right.
I want it to be a place for liberal thought, for critical thought.
Yeah. Yeah. These centers they're calling themselves mostly centers for civic thought. They already exist in several universities and they are catching on. And I have to say, I've been interviewing a number of really top thinkers and observers, yourself included, about this. And this is the one idea that has stood out most to me, is the Center for Civic Thought. Yes, of course, there can be University of Austin, Texas, but it takes years to scale a new university, to get it up and running and so forth. I think they've been on the fast track, and that's wonderful. But to get that to operate at scale would be a huge undertaking. But these centers for civic thought, if they can remain truly independent of the university cultures that are hosting them, and if they can really attract some of the top academic talent and top student talent, I do think that can be a game changer. And I do think it could eventually eclipse the radical humanities and the grievance studies and the like. I'm glad you pointed that out. I think that's the best structural reform I've seen so far.
So if I can add, the two ways to do that structurally are, one, within the private universities, follow the money and try to really get billionaires behind this idea. The genius of it is you don't have to build a whole infrastructure. You don't have to build dorms. All you have to do is take over a building, right? Or just like create a placard, and the infrastructure is there. And that's the big cost, right? So you hire 2 more professors. That's nothing when we talk about the kind of budgets that many of these privates have. And then with the state legislatures, now, and this is really painful for me to say because I'm someone who really believed that state universities and city universities should be as independent as possible. But when I see what they have done with state money, and I see how they're using it to propagandize against the fundamental values of the federal government, the state government, and local government, I say, well, maybe we do need a bit of a backlash. And maybe in state universities, you can use state money to turbocharge these centers of civic thought and of liberal thinking. And all of a sudden, while stripping the DEI regimes and things like that, you also have created an alternative, which is a constructive educational alternative. The key is we've got to get out of the politics. And it's so important, and I know you believe this too. I'm not trying to push my political agenda. I'm trying to simply go back in the best sort of ways, 20, 30 years ago, not to disrespect women and gays and trans people who weren't fully respected then, of course not. But to go back to the ideal of the university, of being open-minded, not closed-minded. And that my job as a university professor was to challenge people to go on their own journey and not to treat them like puppets and I'm like marionettes and I'm the puppet master.
Yeah. So you mentioned DeSantis and there's figures like Chris Rufo and the like. And then there's sort of within the liberal camp, the small L liberal camp are a lot of people who are worried that what we'll do is replace one form of a liberalism on the left with another form of a liberalism on the right, that we won't actually end up with some kind of, restoration of liberal values. We'll just end up with another form of politics in the university that could be equally problematic. What do you think about that?
Look, it's the heartbreaking reality of modern American politics. And let's talk about the fact that we're speaking after Super Tuesday, when who would have thought after January 6th that Donald Trump would be romping his way toward the Republican nomination? And who would have thought, frankly, after a campaign in which he pretty much promised that he was going to be a one-term president just to restore civility, that Joe Biden would be stumbling his way toward a Democratic nomination? And so we're in a situation where we have 2 leaders of parties with whom for many people have lost confidence and who many people have lost confidence. But the second piece is because of the intense polarization. And I saw this with 1619. When the 1619 project came out, there were very thoughtful liberal historians and me. I'm not including myself as a thoughtful historian, but there were many thoughtful liberal historians who said, this is crazy. This is a distortion. This is an assault. How can you start the story of American history merely with the start of the first slave ship in 1619? You have to start it in 1776 when America was independent and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness with all our flaws. And there was pushback. What happened was it came out in August 2019. In July 2020, when Donald Trump jumped on the anti-woke wagon and all of a sudden discovered, I'm sure one of his aides gave him all this thing and he started attacking 1619, all of a sudden you couldn't attack it anymore. So when Donald Trump and then Ron DeSantis launched a war on woke, 2 things happened. First of all, my left-wing friend said, there's no such thing. I said, whatever you want to call it, identitarian, totalitarianism, there's something there, right? And we're certainly seeing it on campus now. And don't keep on, changing the target. There's a thing there. And yes, I can say intellectually that just because Donald Trump disagrees with it, it doesn't make it right. And these toxic dynamics really need to be broken. And so, yes, it's very important for me that it not be hijacked by someone from the right like DeSantis. But if, I follow the work of Christopher Rufo, who, while he's from the right, is also trying to push for what we're pushing for, which is an open-minded, thoughtful, critical regime. And that's what goes on campus. Now, when you join the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, go ahead, be partisan. But take a breath in the university years and in your classroom. You want to join an extracurricular activity that's pushing the Democratic Party, the Republican Party? Great. But in the classroom, the greatest compliment I've gotten in my life as a teacher, 2, one is, wow, you're a really tough grader, but I like the course anyway. And 2 is, are you a Republican or a Democrat? I'm not sure. And I said, it's not my job to leave you sure. It's my job to raise questions.
Yes. Yeah, the problem is, of course, politics can be more of a sledgehammer than a scalpel. And it may be hard to create these reforms without not only ruffling feathers, but actually degrading discourse, even as we try to save it. But there has to be a liberal politics, it seems to me. I think liberals don't like politics because politics is not really a liberal enterprise. I mean, politics uses power, and power is illiberal in many ways. But yet, if we don't use the tools of power, then we're not going to actually have any chance of restoring something that is so structurally entrenched as university cultures are. And I think that's the dilemma the liberal finds him or herself in, and it's something that we have to sort of contend with ourselves and be realistic about it, or we're never going to change the status quo. We're going to be stuck with what we have today, and that's unacceptable too.
Yeah, it's a paradox.
So we have a few more minutes. I'd just like to sort of talk about the Jewish world and what's happening there. I already alluded to this. My operating thesis, although it's early, I speak to a lot of American Jewish groups, as you do, and I'm encountering this new archetype, and these are progressive Jews, liberal Jews, who are really struggling. They're even having a political identity crisis. Some of them say, I don't know where I fit in anymore today. And they're really struggling. And I'm seeing this much more than I thought I would. I mean, it's happening everywhere. And yet I'm not seeing the major American Jewish organizations move. Now, I have a theory. My theory is, and I'd like to try this out on you, is that they get it intellectually, of course. I mean, they're following the trends. These are not stupid people, and then by and large, they're not ideological people. But as soon as they think about changing, let's say they wanted to be critical of DEI, they're immediately thinking about the backlash to that. Well, they've spent years cultivating the NAACP leader who will now regard them as part of the Chris Rufo, Ron DeSantis right. They don't want that, so they revert back to the status quo quite easily. And that's what's happening. They're not really wanting to go there because the price of going there, at least as far, if they're thinking about it this way, is too high. That's what I'm seeing, and I'm imagining that this gulf is just going to widen unless the American Jewish community sort of establishment really contends with this strategic dilemma and moves in a different direction.
I think this is a very important point, and what's going on within the establishment, within the leaders, is very complicated. Look, let's also point out what I'm starting to think of as the double megaphone effect. You have a media which is emphasizing Israeli war crimes and genocide and bombarding everybody, even my most pro-Israel friends in America and Canada, bombarding everybody with these images from Gaza that are very, very difficult. And on top of that, you have the areas where American Jews most worship, the university and the media, turning on Israel. And so you start thinking that most Americans are against Israel, and most progressives are against Israel, and most young American Jews are against Israel. And American Jews fear nobody more than young American Jews. And so it seems like the intellectual and emotional and ideological momentum is with the anti-Zionists. And then you have these articles which quote 12 anti-Zionists, and then they quote me. This literally happened twice in the last week and a half. And so you think, oh my goodness, there's this massive move of anti-Zionists. Where are the progressives? But we know that since October 7th, there are a number of progressives, I agree with you, progressive Jews who were shattered, who saw the rape that feminists formally still haven't acknowledged, too many of them. They saw the depredations. They saw the anti-Semitism. And so our leaders are doubly scared. They're scared of all the people they've created alliances with, including, I'm sorry to say, too many extreme Muslims from CAIR and other extremely anti-Israel and anti-Jewish organizations. They're worried about their African-American partners, but they're also afraid of their kids. And the one loud woke kid outshouts 20 pro-Israel kids.
Yes.
And that's the power of If Not Now, and that's the power of Jewish Voice for Peace, a very, very small group of very intense, highly motivated ideologues are claiming to speak for a generation. And as you said, because of the ambivalence, I call this the silenced majority of good liberals, of kids who just want to go to school and, do their extracurricular activities and do their homework, they're being misrepresented. And so you can have 290,000 mostly Jews marching in Washington, and then 150 Jews blocking the Democratic National Committee headquarters, and the New York Times reports both of them as equal, And the American Jewish establishment is more afraid of the 150 than the 290,000 whom they organized and mobilized to come in a miraculous moment in mid-November. That's how crazy it's gotten.
Yeah, I think that's true. There was this letter that was written by the former students of the Charles E. Smith Jewish Day School, where my older son graduated from. My younger son spent some time there too. And the letter was hypercritical of Israel. It used the language of settler colonialism and the like. And so people started trying to vault the translation. They started worrying a great deal. And what you then saw were two other letters written by other alum that were extraordinarily critical of their fellow grads from the school, and then went on to offer unapologetic support for the state of Israel. And I call that expanding the scope of the referendum, that's sort of core to the work that we do, is that we got to constantly remind people that this radical voice on the left is not represented. And you do that by making sure that people have the opportunity, moderates have the opportunity to register their authentic positions out there, and that comes through to the public. And I think that's starting to happen writ large, but still we have to do more of that. So, it seems to me part of the project here is to get the American Jewish establishment to understand that we've got to look at things differently. Part of it is that I call this the Jewish dilemma in progressive spaces. A lot of Jewish organizations, they live in cities, major cities. Those cities, Chicago's not the most liberal city, but it's certainly in the city itself is. Silicon Valley, LA, Boston, and the like. They have a stake in these relationships with people on the left, and they built these relationships for a long time. And so now there's a price of admissions to pay. The price of admission may be proactive. In order to be part of this coalition, you must say that America is a white supremacist state. You must sign that statement, or you must do that. Or in order to have good standing in California, you must agree with the oppressed framework in ethnic studies, even if you oppose the very blatant anti-Semitic aspects of ethnic studies. And there's also the other kind of price you pay, the price of silence. We will not oppose DEI because you will call us out for it. You will say that we're racist if you do. And that's where I think that second category is happening more and more now. People are just fearful of the trade-off. And maybe there's a reason for that. Maybe as soon as you go down the path that people like me have, I think people like you have, and start to name these ideologies as truly dangerous to the Jewish condition, you are self-isolating. You've made a strategic departure from the usual paradigm, and they just can't bear to do that. Am I wrong?
No, look, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier about the megaphone effect, which is even on university campuses, how many people are getting up in the middle of the winter and yelling and screaming Israel apartheid and Zionism is racism? It's a small group, but they're running the conversation. Yes. So I call that the megaphone or the mini megaphone phenomenon. You also have the second problem of the Bill Clinton phenomenon. What was Bill Clinton's problem? And his chief counsel once said it to him. He said, Bill, when you walk into a room, you zero in, are there one or two or three people who most hate you? And you spend all your energy trying to get them to like you. You're forgetting that 97% of the people in the room or 99% of the people love you. Play to them. And the American Jewish community is guilty of this, always going to the margins, especially to the Jewish kids, but even the critics from the outside. Oh my goodness, we might not be popular. Well, you know what? I have to say, certainly after October 7th, I'm okay with not being popular. I'd rather be alive. I'd rather be healthy. I'd rather be free than be popular. And for years, I went around speaking to college students and I said, oh, look, we're Startup Nation. We're really nice. We're really good. We're really productive. And you know what now? I'm not apologizing for Israel anymore. I think we've seen who Israel's enemies are. We've seen what defeat looks like at the hands of our enemies. And so I'm comfortable calling for victory, even though I've been told that's not a politically correct term. I'm comfortable saying that we have to have an absolute clear victory. And I'm comfortable saying, which side are you on? Would you rather be on the side of us with all our complexities, all our mistakes, but our righteousness? Or be on the side of Palestinian dictators, of Hamas mass murderers, of mass rapists? I mourn the death of every innocent child in Gaza, but I know that it's on Hamas's head And I also know that our kill ratios, and it's an ugly argument to make, but I know that our kill ratios are remarkably low, the number of civilians killed to Hamas killed. But we don't get any credit for that because it doesn't sound as good as stop the bombing and the genocide. I'll live with the complexity and I'll take the hit because we have no choice but to survive and to fight both ideologically and existentially.
Yeah. A former version of me who knew you back then, maybe a decade ago, 15 years ago, was very interested in the messaging and how to best massage our message to be able to speak to whatever target audience. Maybe it was a mainstream liberal target audience that was maximally calibrated to campus opinion. First of all, I don't think it works anymore. It's just become too ideologically polarized. And I think right now, the task is not to try to score temporary points, but to really stand our ground intellectually, morally, and the like. I think exactly what you're saying. You know, Gil, I really appreciate your time. As I knew it would be, it was extremely, incisive conversation. And I'd like to bring you back on at some point and sort of see where we are several months from now and see if we can see where we've been and where we've gone to. So thank you.
We're brothers. Keep up the great work.
Thanks a million. You too. Be well. Thank you for tuning in to The Contrarian. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Don't forget to rate our podcast on Apple and Spotify. Stay connected with us on social media for more updates. Until next time, keep challenging.